Hi, and thank you for joining me for another lecture. And today, friends, we're going to cover a topic that many shy away from, and that is the topic of how long is a woman supposed to separate from her husband because of Niddah, and what does that separation entail. And we're also going to cover smaller topics that have to do with this main topic. Now, I have to warn you that everything you will hear in this lecture, everything is for educational purposes only, and not necessarily practical ones. I mean, I don't want to get phone calls that you were kicked out of your community or your local mikvah because you decided to act on the information I'm giving you today, although it's all absolutely factual and true. And friends, really, I'll be the first to admit that at least to what Hilchot Niddah has become, this topic is not easy or too easy to understand. Now, if you would ask your average rabbi, you will hear that in Judaism, a married woman who gets her period is required to count 7 spot-free days from the end of her period, which has been predetermined by modern rabbis to be, if you're Ashkenazi, 5 days and 4 days if you're Sephardi. And then she must immerse, which typically brings the days of separation with her husband to 12 days and 11 days if you're Sephardi. Also, another interesting side note is that in the time of the Gemara, single women immerse in the mikvah also at the end of their period, mainly so they wouldn't contaminate truma or not be able or stop others from visiting the temple. Because Niddah back then and truma was an actual reality. Not like today, not to mention that women also got married much younger back then, so if a woman was menstruating, she was most likely married or about to get married. Now, my job today is not only to simplify all this and explain it in the clearest way possible, but also to show you areas that have just been made up and unjustly thrusted on the Jewish community at large. But regardless, after all this, God willing, you should end up with a clearer perspective on not just what you're actually doing, but on why you're doing it. But in truth, friends, Orthodox Judaism has been hijacked, and it's been hijacked by ascetic nuts, and many of our customs reflect their leadership. And this is one of the main reasons that Dor De'ah strives to educate the masses, because Torah Sheba'al Peh as well as Torah Shebektav is not only being corrupted, in many cases it's completely being desecrated. And honestly, today's topic is a perfect example of this. So, friends, to begin, the Torah forbids men to sleep with a woman during her period. That much from the Pashat is clear. And this reason also encompasses any takana, any gezerah instituted by Chazal on this topic. In other words, along with Tumat Niddah, the impurity one acquires by having contact with a Niddah, there is also an Isur Biyah, a prohibition on sexual relations with a Niddah. And these two, and only these two, are the two culprits on the table today. In other words, any sort of not touching will center around these two issues. And regarding the Pashat, you may or may not already know that the notion of a woman having to go to a mikvah after her Niddah does not explicitly appear in Torah Shebektav. It doesn't appear in the actual written Torah, although many Rishonim state that it alludes to it. But regardless, it's fine to assume that it was fully instituted by Chazal. Now, one reason I say this is to help you strip away anything mystical regarding this experience. In other words, we do it because we're commanded to do it. If not directly by Hashem, then by the court that He ordained. Now, the idea of not touching a Niddah because of Tumah, because of ritual impurity, is actually null and void today. Mainly because we don't have a temple anymore, or the ashes of the red heifer used to purify a Tamei Met, someone who has an impurity that one acquires through contact with the dead body, and also something that everyone today is in some way expected to have. Also, we don't need truma or deal with kochim anymore, which is exactly what the Rambam states in Hilchot Tumat Ochlin. So the next time you hear that you can't touch a woman on the basis that she's tamei or impure, remember that that's not the reason, my friends. And friends, this is really an area that really has to be cleared up. That's that becoming tamei or ceremonially or ritually unclean is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. In other words, by becoming ceremonially or remaining ceremonially unclean, which, like I said, is a state that virtually everyone is in today, is really nothing that should keep you up at night. In other words, it's not necessarily tied to sin in any way, nor is anyone sinning by becoming or remaining unclean. For example, women become tameh monthly and during childbirth, right? The Kohanim who prepared the ashes of the paraduma also became tameh, or someone could even become tameh for the sake of a mitzvah, right? Like preparing a body for burial. Now, this was the reality even in the times of Chazal, right? The Mishnah even states that someone who volunteered to keep the prohibitions pertaining to Tumah and Tahara all year round was called a Porush, meaning a separated person. Someone who separated himself from Tumah and from impurity, when he practically really didn't have to. And friends, these are not to be confused with the Perushim. Not to say that many Perushim or Pharisees didn't join their ranks. And really, it makes you think what's fueling this whole mikvah craze for men nowadays, especially Hasidim who go to the mikvah every day. But anyways, another reason it's strange is because there's actually no part in Torah that requires a Jew to remain clean all year round, with the exception of during the 3 major Chagim, where visiting the temple was an actual mitzvah and thus mandatory. But regardless, you're probably wondering, then why do we need to avoid touching a Niddah if the notion of actual ritual purity is not a concern in our day and age? Well, friends, the short answer is that although the notion of ritual purity is not important in Torah and Halakha, Torah still specifically prohibits sexual relations with a Niddah, with a woman during her period. So in other words, the whole prohibition is only to avoid an Isur Biyah, a forbidden relationship to occur. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, Rabbi Asher, we have constantly heard from those who adhere to being Shomer Negiah that the reason we're not allowed to touch between males and females is because of Tumat Niddah, because of the impurity imparted from a Niddah. Now, to give the Shomer Negiah crowd some credit, most people who say that they're Shomer Negiah really do not know why they're not touching the opposite sex, and really just boil it down to stating that it's not modest to do so. And will then just say Tumat Niddah because they know that it must be affiliated with that notion to some extent. And it is. In other words, the real reason the Shomer Negiah crowd abstains from touching the opposite sex is because every woman is supposedly considered to be in a Niddah state. And there is a prohibition in sleeping with a Niddah. And of course, friends, as you know, shaking hands leads to sex. No, not at all, friends. Actually, the prohibition of not touching at all does not appear in any Talmudic source and was only later proposed as a chumrah, as a stringency by the minority of medieval rabbis, and because it made its way into the Shulchan Aruch, it became the norm. However, if you're like us who understands that all halakha has to have its basis within the pages of Talmudic literature, this custom of being Shomer Negiah gets shot down. So friends, there's really no halachic reason to justify the Shomer Negiah phenomenon we see occurring today. Not to in any way justify kissing and hugging between unmarried couples, but the ridiculous extreme that has been taken and is being practiced is really baseless. Actually, the Gemara lists many examples of the rabbis hugging and kissing arayot. Mind you, the contact is not intimate or sensual or sexual in nature, right? But it's enough to show you that there is no clear prohibition against contact in general. In other words, it is true that we are forbidding from contact with an erva, which in our case would be any woman with her period. And it's also true that every woman is pretty much considered to be having her period, mainly because we're not going to ask them if they are. However, what we must not fail to mention is that the prohibition of contact with an erva is only the contact of a sensual, seductive nature that again will lead to intercourse and not just any touching. Now, unfortunately, this whole issue of being Shomer Negiah and people saying that this is the actual standard given on Har Sinai, in my opinion, is just one more thing to keep religious Jews from returning to Judaism or people from converting into Judaism, is really not confronted by modern day rabbis. And I really cannot think of many things that Orthodox rabbis today confront at all, which should really speak about the lack of courage that exists in the Orthodox world today. Really, the more religious they claim to be usually goes hand in hand with the amount of courage they lack. And friends, one extra principle that I will leave with you today is that you should know that in Orthodoxy, typically the longer the beard, the least halachically impressive the individual. In other words, we have a world that is dying, and the only hope is unequivocally Torah Judaism. And the last thing we need is for leaders in the religious Jewish community not to speak up when their belief system is being hijacked by ascetics who think they could decide Jewish law outside of halakha. And friends, what you could be sure about is that we here at Dor De'ah will give you the halakha, and only the halakha that the Almighty endorsed the Sanhedrin to impart, minus the fluff. And friends, in regards to Niddah and what's done today, like we said earlier in the shiur, that the minhag is to extend the counting for 7 days from the 5 days, which could actually be on a deraita level, extending it for 5 more days, 4 days of your Sephardi. Did you get that? Look, the Torah and Chazal said that a woman remained in her period of Niddah for 7 days and went to the mikvah early on the 8th day, which would be at night following the 7th day, because remember, in Torah, the day begins when the sun goes down. So the beginning of the 8th day would actually be the night following the end of the 7th day. However, the Talmud states that around the 3rd century, that women decided that the counting between that of a Niddah and a Zava was too complicated, so they took it upon themselves to count the counting of a Zava Gedolah, which would be counting 7 clean days from the time that their flow ceased, that they took this counting as the norm, which meant that if the flow only lasted 1 day, she would then perform a hefsek tahara, a final check, and then begin her count. And again, this was the practice adopted by the daughters of Israel, like it states in the Gemara, and not the actual halakha. And after this, we see that the Achronim, the rabbis, post the Renaissance, decided to pre-calculate when a woman's flow would stop, which was 5 days for Ashkenazim and 4 days for Sephardim, which then meant that a woman would start counting 7 clean days after that and end the whole process on the 12th day if you're Ashkenazi, and 11 days of your Sephardi, not including going to the mikvah on the following day. In other words, friends, the last additional days to her counting was only adopted as a custom and was never a halakha for women, at least a woman who was not a zava. And if you really want to be honest, rabbis should not lie and call it Niddah, but just call it zava. I mean, the counting is identical to that of a zava gedolah and not a Niddah, a woman who's in Niddah because of her menstrual cycle. In other words, standard Niddah counting does not require so many checks, right? Because Mishneh Niddah counting, if you knew that you had a flow that day, began to count down no matter what you did till the 7th day, when you were pretty much guaranteed to be done with your period, right? A final light check was done to make sure that you weren't a Zavah, and that's it. You went to the mikvah, and you were permissible to your husband. A total of 7 days of separation. Now, a Zava was a woman who bled outside of her menstrual cycle, which halachically was blood that appeared within 11 days, counting from the end of her period. Now, a Zava Katana was a Zava who bled for less than 3 days and would then wait till her flow ended and then immersed. And like we just said, that a Zava Gedolah was one who bled for more than 3 days, and then after the 3 days of bleeding have stopped, she then counted 7 clean days and then immersed. Are you guys catching all this? It's a little bit complicated, but feel free to review the video if you have to really get this down. And friends, regarding separating from a Zava, which is someone who bleeds outside their menstrual cycle, the separation, or at least the rules of separation, are identical to that of a Niddah. And yes, there is a separation that needs to take place. We're not arguing with this fact, but the separation is only from contact that may lead to sexual intercourse, and not just any contact. In fact, the Rambam explicitly states this in Mishneh Torah, in Hilchot Sanhedrin, in Perek Yud Tet. It states that one who comes close to one of the arayot in any of the promiscuous ways, right, it says midarche hazenut. So again, it's only promiscuous touching. Actually, the Shulchan Aruch was really one of the first sources of its time to prohibit all contact, which is why we see it almost as the norm nowadays. The Siftei Cohen brings down that when the Rambam prohibited kissing and hugging, right, that he was only referring to kissing and hugging associated with intercourse. Not to mention that the Sephardi minhag, even among women was to kiss the hands of the Chachamim, which I don't have to tell you could not be done if people took that little portion of the Shulchan Aruch seriously. So friends, long story short, the counting for Niddah was replaced by the counting for a Ziva Gedolah. So really, to all extent and purposes, we should really be calling this Nidot Zavot, because that is really what they are behaving like with these practices. And this, my friends, is really something that bothers the heck out of students of halakha. Why? Because the halakha, as it appears in the Mishnah, is that once a woman knows that her period has begun, she begins counting 7 days, and on the evening of the 8th, she immerses, and then she is tahor and permitted to her husband. However, again, as Rabbi Zera later states in the Gemara, that due to Jewish women confusing the counting of Niddah and Zava Katana and Zava Gedolah, that they then decided to adopt the most stringent of all the three, which, like we said, is that of the Zava Gedolah state, as the new norm and any minimal Tameh period. And this whole sugya regarding the daughters of Israel adopting this minhag on themselves came to be known as Chumrah de Rabbi Zera, stringency of Rabbi Zera, which is why women today have the difficult practice of separating for up to 12 days instead of only the 7 days that halakha requires. And again, this was only a Chumrah that the women of the 3rd century took upon themselves. Now, I'm not stating that it's wrong to take upon yourself this Chumrah, but rather to impose it on all, especially given the problems that it may cause in someone's relationship. This, my friends, is when the problem arises. Because, for example, there's an actual problem that arises in about 20% of Jewish women that is known as halachic infertility. In other words, many couples, due to this chumrah, this stringency, are not able to conceive because there are many women who ovulate prior to when they have to go to the mikvah, which means that before modern science, there have been countless Orthodox women who were forced to remain barren. Not to mention, one could only imagine all the women who were made to divorce because they couldn't conceive. Again, only because of this custom. Now, it's true that due to modern medicine, rabbis are giving couples the option to shorten the wait in order to conceive. But again, this wasn't always the case. And another issue is the additional separation that couples are forced to endure. And it's really completely disingenuous when you ever hear Orthodox Jews boast on how great the separation between couples are. And I'm sure you've heard it, that it spices up the marriage and increases desire for couples to not even touch virtually half of their entire lives together. It's like, have a stringency will justify. Look, friends, it's hard enough to justify practices that we're obligated to do, to then on top of that justify every cultural stringency that has no basis in Jewish law. And worse, they'll even go as far as to tell people that this is what God says, that this is what the Torah says. The chutzpah, my friends. Actually, you'll probably be surprised to hear that this statement of separation enticing your marriage was actually said by Chazal, but not regarding the 12-day separation that we see today, but rather, my friends, it was said regarding the 7-day separation. Now, that's something that these modern day rabbis will never tell you. And knowing that, did you also know that Chazal ruled, before this silly custom was adopted, that the maximum that a man could take a vow of abstaining from sexual intercourse from his wife was 2 weeks. And if he went any more, he would actually be required to divorce his wife. Now, given this attitude, we can assume that they would not have been on board with Rabbi Zera's Chumrah. In other words, they viewed a 2-week separation bordering the line of unhealthy, but now it just becomes the norm. I mean, honestly, why try to be firmer than Chazal? Now, I understand that this is not just any old custom, friends, okay? That is obviously clear, because according to some, this practice became universally accepted. For even the Rishonim held this practice in high regard. From the Rambam, the Ramban, and actually the majority of poskim held that this is more than just any old custom, but a minhag that held substantial gravitas. Now, some regarding with doing away with this practice even requires women to be mater neder, that they should nullify the practice as one does a vow, while others believe that you would need an actual full-blown Sanhedrin to get rid of this practice. But regardless, at least on a halachic level, we could all agree on the notion of safek derabanan lehakel, that because one is commanded to be lenient on rabbinic rulings if there's a doubt or a question on whether the ruling may have been erroneous, or if it's even harmful for us to practice that today, I think this is the main principle we all should utilize. And remember, friends, that this is not even an actual ruling, but a custom that took hold in the 3rd century among Amoraim, right? Even the Rambam in Hilchot Niddah calls it ka-halacha, that it's like a halacha, but not an actual halacha. So, if you're wondering, what's the suffix? Well, like I said, for one, halachic infertility, right? The bickering and strain that it causes on a marriage, the masturbation or exposure to pornography that may take place because of it, the urge to visit prostitutes, the fear that you will be encouraged to violate other real prohibitions because of a minhag. Not to mention that Amoraim could never have the authority to establish halachot in the first place. Why? Because they did not have smicha. Now, it is true that some of the early Amoraim did have smicha, like Rav Yochanan and Rav, but in Amora without smicha could not establish halacha, nor in some way extend or contradict any of the existing halachot, mainly because, again, in most cases, they did not have smicha. Okay? Clear so far? And I know this is a lot of information to take in, and I also must remind you that everything I'm telling you here is for educational purposes only. Although it's absolutely factual, absolutely true. And if you live in a certain community, do what that community requires, but you must know why you're doing what you do. And regarding the custom of waiting 4 or 5 days before performing the hefsek tahara, which is mainly a check to ensure that you have stopped bleeding, and then starting to count the 7 clean days, this is really a practice you could drop immediately. Why? Because this is not endorsed anywhere in the Gemara. In other words, right when the bleeding stops, even if it stops on the first day and a badika is performed and you're found to be clean, you can then begin counting the 7 clean days immediately. And regarding the dreaded mochdachuk, right, the act of stuffing cut pieces of cotton into the vagina, this is also a chumrah, a stringency that is not required. Friends, look, let me tell you something. With every stringency that you endorse and worse, teach as normative Torah Judaism, all you do is get more people from either returning to Judaism or considering a Jewish lifestyle for themselves. So if you think those consequences are worth it, then you really have no need for not justifying baseless practices. And friends, I know that this shiur may sound a little harsh, but I believe in Torah and what it endorses. Why? Because it works. Torah works and the rulings of Chazal work. But when later rabbis try to stick their hands into the halachic system, they usually always end up screwing it up. Not to mention that they didn't have the authority to do it in the first place, to change or add to halachot. In other words, the Torah endorsed the Sanhedrin, to develop laws, and these laws are what's known as Torah Sheba'al Peh. And any new ideas outside of Torah Shebiktav and Torah Sheba'al Peh should really be left up to scrutiny, my friends. And the topic today is no exception. Okay? And I'll try to keep the musar down to a minimum. But anyways, friends, if the extra time that they added to separate was not enough, later poskim, i.e. not rabbis from the Mishnah or the Talmud, initiated extra harhakot just because they felt like it. Now, harhakot are additional restrictions developed to keep couples from ultimately engaging in sexual intercourse. And the halakha itself describes certain harhakot, like things that a woman cannot do in front of her husband, or precautions that must be taken during this period, like not washing her husband's face and feet, or making his bed in front of him, or mixing his wine, anything that might entice him and get him to have intercourse. So one can say that Chazal touched on this topic, but again, only they had the authority to touch on this topic. Now fast forward to where we're at today, where we are forced to toss things over to our spouses because now even passing things have become prohibited, when the rabbis of the Talmud never adopted such practices. And another harhaka, which I would say is one of the more famous ones, is the supposed prohibition of a couple sleeping in the same bed. So to begin with, the Gemara never straight out mentions that there is a prohibition of a couple sleeping in the same bed while his wife is menstruating, right? It never brings it down as an actual prohibition, which is why the vast majority of poskim never included it as a prohibition till, again, the Shulchan Aruch popularized this chumrah. And really, the rabbis who permitted this straight out were rabbis like Rabbi Yerucham, the Rashbam, the author of Machzor Vitri and Sefer Hawara, in modern times Rabbi Yehuda Henkin, and not to mention the countless others like the Rambam, who don't even mention it like a prohibition. Okay? So far, we have only discussed Niddah because of a woman's period. Now, there are a few other instances that I'm not going to cover in depth in this shiur, like a woman who becomes Niddah because of childbirth, or because of excitement, or because of hymenal bleeding, right? Dam betulim. And I'm also not going to mention ketamim, stains. Look, friends, anything that I fail to cover in this short shiur is really covered all over the internet. And because the trend, at least regarding Niddah, is not to be less but to be more strict nowadays, you're pretty much safe. I mean, I'm sure anything you would find in the popular Orthodox Jewish websites would suffice. But quickly, for any of these, with the exception of Niddah because of childbirth, the waiting is the same as we described for a regular Niddah. Also, a Niddah because of childbirth lasts for 7 days after the birth of a boy and 14 days after the birth of a girl. And the counting begins from the first sign of blood. Now, in regards to a hefsek tahara, or doing a proper bedikah in terms of how it's done, this is not explicitly explained by Chazal. And I think the Badika cloths they sell today should work great. And also, there are many websites out there that can explain in detail how they think best to do a check. And another custom that sometimes makes it a little difficult for women attending a mikvah is the notion that one must go with a partner. Now, this custom is definitely sensible, but it is actually a fairly new one. In other words, it's not in any Mishnaic source. So the reason that the custom was created was to make sure that the tevilah was done properly. In other words, to make sure that no hair remains outside the water while you're dipping. But if you had to go alone, there are ways to assure that the hair goes down with you. Right? However, most mikvot nowadays employ a mikvah lady who is there all the time to help you out, especially in these cases. And a few more FYIs, just in case I haven't confused you enough tonight. You must know that unmarried women are not expected to go to the mikvah. Also, if you do not have an indoor mikvah and you really need to go, you can just go to a secluded beach, even in the daytime if it's too dangerous for you to go at night. And silly customs like sleeping with a knife under your pillow when your husband's away and you just went to the mikvah, I don't have to tell you that these are just silly and a waste of your time. And friends, I hope I was able to help you understand Hilchot Niddah a little better tonight. And if you're interested in learning more about Judaism in general, please visit TorahJudaism.org. Again, that's www.TorahJudaism.org. Thank you.